Human resources, human capital, people, and culture. This single vocation has many names. HR professionals are responsible for what is arguably the most critical success factor within any organization. It's talent. HR Studio Podcast brings you bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond. Listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. For over 35 years, AJO has built its reputation on experienced listening, exceptional quality, and caring partnerships, delivering services in 30 states and 20 countries. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com and be sure to check out our top-ranked HR blog and sign up to receive email alerts while you're there.
So welcome everyone to HR Studio Podcast. I'm Fred Bunsa and I'm going to be your host for today's episode. I'm very excited to have Carlos Valdes-Dapena with us today. Carlos is the founder of Corporate Collaboration Resources, an organization and group effectiveness consulting firm. He also has a new book coming out. He's the author of a book called Lessons from Mars: How One Global Company Cracked the Code on High-Performance Collaboration and Teamwork. Carlos has been working in collaboration and teamwork with organizations for over 17 years. He spent a lot of time at an organization called Mars Incorporated. I'm sure you all know them. He worked on brands like M&Ms, Snickers, Uncle Ben's Rice, and Wrigley's Gum. I'm getting a little hankering while we talk here, just introducing him. He actually won some awards there for the work he did with teams. The Global Make the Difference Award, which was given to him based on his work on the Mars framework for high-performance collaboration, which is partly what we'll talk about today. Prior to Mars, Carlos spent 3 years at IBM as an executive coach and consultant, working with their top 35 global leaders, including a couple of the former CEO Lou Gerstner's direct reports. And he began his consulting career in 1993 when he was working with DDI, the global talent development firm, where he was a leadership and performance management consultant. So Carlos comes to us with some great experience. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, Carlos.
Thank you, Fred. Delightful to be here.
We are excited to chat. You and I have chatted a couple times about your new book and the teamwork that you've done, and it's I'm already have my advanced copy order in. But in your book, I haven't gotten it yet because it's not out, but you told me that you've got, you talk about in there the fact that companies prefer when they're hiring, the profile is often action-oriented, results-focused people. And yet sometimes those traits tend to drive people to work individually and not so much as a team. It can even inhibit their teamwork and their collaboration. The framework you've got specifically addresses that to take advantage of the tension. So given our HR audience and the hiring and the teams that they're responsible for, tell us a little bit about how you manage that tension.
Well, so this is all part of my time at Mars, right? And we were struggling, like a lot of companies do, with how to inspire, how to unleash more and more effective collaboration. It's a global company, 35 to 40 billion dollar company, over 100,000 Mars associates around the world, and a high degree of need, a high need for collaboration across regions, even across brands and segments from time to time. How do you do that? As you were pointing out, like a lot of other big companies, Mars hires great individuals, right? You recruit for them, you look for them, you pay individuals, you recognize individuals, you promote individuals. So you hire great folks. All the systems in the company are operating to reinforce that drive they have to get stuff done. And look, Mars has done extremely well over the 17 years I was there. The growth was terrific. The company is very healthy, still is. I left Mars at the end of last year, but those individuals do wonders, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, Mars and other companies talk teamwork a great deal. I mean, again, the need is there. The need is real. The way we talk about, the way we, meaning large companies, talk about that is valid, but not very effective So you walk into a typical large company's office and you see the posters on the wall with the rowers at sunset,
Right.
teamwork emblazoned across it. You see the Myers-Briggs typed in wooden blocks on people's desks. All these artifacts of teamwork, and yet we're still not getting the collaboration we need as a large company. So I was confronted with this challenge. And so we started to look at it. I've been working with teams at Mars for about 5 years at this point, and someone said, you've got all this great data, you ought to look into it. And it was there that we made this interesting discovery, that people recognize this desire and need for collaboration, but that drive to achieve, that focus on results, they tend to default to what gets results fastest, which is
individual
effort.
work. Yeah, sure.
You can't blame them for it. Now, to turn to team building for a second. Aside from the posters and the wooden blocks on people's desks, people go off and do team building exercises. Now, most of these, Fred, are focused, not all, but most, on relationships and trust building, right? The underlying unstated belief is that, I put it this way, that familiarity breeds collaboration. If I know you a little better, if I know what your Myers-Briggs type is, if I know what your favorite hobbies are, if we can sit down and have a heart-to-heart talk, we'll collaborate better. But it wasn't working. We were doing a lot of that at Mars. I mean, we were spending millions of dollars per year in that kind of traditional team building based in relationship, trust, even addressing conflict, and yet we weren't seeing any more collaboration or any more effective collaboration.
Okay.
Right? So, in looking at the data, that's when we made this discovery. We realized that tension that exists between we want you to be a star performer, right? We want you to do that. It's good for the business. It's good for you. And we want you to be hyper collaborative was unresolved. It wasn't, no team building we were doing, no number of posters we were putting up was resolving it for us.
Okay.
It was then that we asked the question. And it took months to get to the question. We realized we had to ask ourselves, is there some way that we can make collaboration feel like just another thing to be achieved?
So take it from a group effort back to an individual effort working on collaboration.
It's a little bit like that, but even more specifically, Fred, we tend to treat teamwork and collaboration as concepts, as generically good, big ideas that are just things we want and ought to do, right?
Okay.
The difference between generic concept and I've got this hunk of work over here that needs to get done by this date with this specific outcome, and it's going to show up in my performance assessment at the end of the year, right? From vague to specific, what are you going to move towards? You're going to go to the specific.
Absolutely, every time.
Every time. And so that's what we were solving for. How can we make collaboration something so clear and so specific that these achievement-driven people will be drawn to it just as they're drawn to the individual work that they're held accountable for? And so we built a framework with that understanding of individual motivation at its heart. And that's the breakthrough, and that's what I'm excited to talk about, and that's what the book talks about. It's that marriage between individual motivation and group dynamics and effectiveness that makes this framework work. So we created this thing. Now, that theoretical understanding about individual motivation and group dynamics is not obvious when you look at this framework. We don't have a graphic with us here, but it's a circle with 5 or 6 parts to it. Talk about the things we call the practices that teams need to engage in order to get high performance collaboration. The theory is buried, and it's irrelevant. Our managers, when presented with this framework and some explanation of how it works, it's been amazing how they take to it like ducks to water, right? And it's because it was the Mars culture of achievement and drive that gave birth to this framework, and it's embedded in the framework. So there's a cultural harmony with the framework that people just intuitively seem to get. So I think I mentioned to you in one of our conversations, the Mars framework for high performance collaboration was never posted on the company intranet. It was never part of an official internal campaign. It was embedded in one little management development program we ran every year for a few thousand new managers. And it took off. absolutely viral. Today, it's the standard for effective collaboration at Mars, and it got there simply because we built it to speak to people and to appeal to that achievement drive.
So is it? I presume if you wrote a book, it's not unique to that kind of a culture. So how do you bring it and embed it and get it to be so successful in other places?
One of the things I learned, having worked at DDI, right, where I had a lot of clients, AT&T, General Motors, Pfizer, tick down a list of Fortune 100 companies, although that list changes all the time, but current or at some point Fortune 100 companies, my time at IBM, right, I've been exposed to a lot of the cultures of a lot of big companies. And it struck me after the fact, after I developed this framework at Mars, these people weren't really all that different from the folks I knew at IBM or the folks I was coaching or training at AT&T or General Motors. There was a ton of similarity. So what I did is I started talking to people about it. I went to a conference down in Tampa a few years ago where I brought this up to a Harvard professor whose books I've admired and worked from. And ran this idea by him. He said, I think you're right. I think you're onto something there that goes beyond the Mars culture. Mars is not unique in its desire for results and action-oriented people. Right? That's kind of, now, this I will say, it's kind of a Western norm, right? I don't know that this would necessarily be true in all national or regional cultures. But in Western-style companies, this framework seems to work.
Interesting. So one of the things that you've also talked about is that focus on individual and their motivation, and how it influences the dysfunction that we often will talk about in teams, or at least label behavior as dysfunction. And you've got some interesting views on that. Tell us a little more.
Sure. As you point out, my awakening to the importance of understanding the individual has shifted all of my thinking about what accounts for team effectiveness, but also for team dysfunction. And look, Brett, I learned, like most of us do, from my mistakes. I mean, I screwed up big time in a couple of ways, more than a couple of ways over my career, and some of those ways involved teams that were really troubled. And as I started to put those experiences through this filter, I came to the understanding that most of what's labeled team dysfunction, right? And by the way, guys like me, consultants like me, male or female, or otherwise, we sort of thrive in that space of dysfunction. It's really kind of exciting and dangerous and edgy, right? Get in there with that team that's kind of at each other's throats. What am I going to do? How can I be a help and feel good about it and help them feel good? It's rewarding and fascinating in a dark sort of way. So I wasn't looking to upset my own impressions about this. I thought I was pretty good at doing it the way I always did it. And then it occurred to me, as I looked back over my career and over some of these so-called dysfunctional team experiences, that in every case I could identify, the dysfunctional team was rooted in an individual. It was usually one person who wasn't carrying their weight, who was didn't have the right skills to be on the team, a bad hire, right? Not their own fault, just in the wrong job at the wrong time. And what would happen is the team would start to accommodate this problem person, right? Mm-hmm. There'd be back channel conversations. There'd be little coalitions formed against this person, or the manager might protect this person, but it all revolved around an individual. And on more than one occasion, talking about the times I messed up, I'd be asked to go in to help a dysfunctional team, and I would try to apply a group solution to really what was an individual performance problem. When in fact, and here's the kicker to this, an individual performance problem is really in the realm of the team leader. Right? I mean, that's if you're managing somebody and they're not carrying their weight, not up to the task, for better or for worse, it's your job as team leader / manager to intervene, to do what needs to be done, to coach, right?
Right, to address the issue, address the person.
Address generous person. You do that, the team issue goes away. If you go in with a team intervention, and at least in one case, what you get is the team ganging up on the person who hasn't been performing, making them feel even worse, making the manager look bad because the manager hasn't stepped up and done what they're supposed to do. And you see, that's the thing here. Sometimes it's an individual in the team, but no matter where, and sometimes, by the way, the performance issue is the manager. Sometimes they're simply not up to it. And I've seen this happen several times. They were promoted too soon. They were promoted without the appropriate development, not given the right tools to do the job. They weren't set up for success. Okay. And so the team gets in trouble. But it's not a team issue. It's a manager issue. And I keep trying to get to this point, talking around it. Even if it's a person on the team, ultimately, it's a manager issue because they're not doing what they need to do to help get that person on track, to give them what they need to succeed, or to manage them out of the business. So for me, most team function actually boils down to individual problems, dysfunction, and it's always a manager problem, whether the manager is the problem or the manager is failing to act on the problem.
Yeah, and so how would you, in thinking about, our audience of HR leaders and just leaders in general, do they not run team interventions and really focus on having individual conversations? What basic approach do you help people follow to identify, is this a team problem or is this an individual problem?
Well, so I'm often engaged by the HR leader or the HR member of the team, right, to come in and help with something. Yeah. Right. So for me, that relationship is vital. As a consultant working in this space, I want to be, my client, of course, is the team leader, but my partner is usually an HR professional. Mm-hmm. So that's one bit. Before I walk into the room with the team, I will have had conversations with every team member. Right? And if I smell something is off, I'll go back to the leader, and if we've got an appropriate contract, back to the HR partner and say, okay, guys, I'm halfway through these interviews, and I'm getting a sense that person X is at the crux of this issue. Right? The name keeps coming up, the same stories keeps coming up. There's something going on here in the realm of individual performance that needs to be dealt with. How can we do this? I've called off a couple of team sessions when this has arisen, and I've always done that in partnership with not only the team leader but also but with the HR person, knowing that that's a big part of the role is their understanding of human performance and development. So it's something I look for pre-workshop. If I sense it in a workshop, then we just call it, right?
Yep. Yeah.
We just stop it cold, say, guys, we need to have another approach here, and there'll be an intervention afterwards. It'll involve only the most appropriate people. This advice about dysfunctional individuals versus dysfunctional teams was something first I formulated for a couple of my friends in HR roles, because they would come to me with perfectly good intent and with sound reasoning, saying, this team's in trouble. We need your particular skill set. And I found I had to go back to these folks I'd go back to and say, not really a team issue. And if we try to apply a team fix to it, it's going to get ugly. Let's talk about an alternative. So in fact, I fashioned this after I made this discovery. It was HR folks I was talking to typically about it because of their role in engaging me.
Yeah. And yet I would imagine that even if you address that individual, there's still work to be done with the team, right? To improve their performance and improve their collaboration. And in fact, your model has a lot of tools and approaches to do that, right?
Oh, so the simple advice is don't try to fix an individual performance problem with a team intervention.
Okay.
Once you address the individual performance problem, then of course any team should be thinking about the quality of its collaboration and how it wants to enhance that. And we therefore, in my case, I'll apply this framework we developed at Mars to do that. But sure, yeah, and every team, by the way, has got its performance soft spots, right? Okay. There will always be a bell curve of performance. You're going to have your high performers, you're going to have your lower performers, and some folks in the middle. Anytime I engage with a group, I work with the leader to assess what that looks like, right? What's the performance picture of this team? And my question typically is there anybody at this team who's at risk right now, right? Is there anybody who's at risk, and that where we have to be careful about how we approach that? Again, we don't want that person bearing an unhealthy burden during the workshop because they feel like they're in the hot seat all the time.
Okay, and when you say at risk, what do you mean by that?
Well, so let's say you and I are on a team, right? And I'm pretty good at what I do. You're a superstar, right? Everybody knows Carlos is working hard. He's pretty good at what he does, and he doesn't drop the ball, right? So Carlos isn't at risk. At risk would be a person who is actually driving dysfunctional behavior in the group because they aren't carrying their weight. They don't have the skills. They haven't been properly prepared. They're at risk if they're being performance managed of possibly losing their job, right?
Okay, got it.
That's what I mean by at risk.
Okay.
Because performance is not equally distributed across a group. Some people are just going to be stronger than others. We want to know where the strengths are, where the deficits are, work with that. And if there's somebody who's in an extreme end of low performance, that's something to watch out for.
Okay. Carlos, as we begin to wrap up, I wanted to highlight the one of the tools that you have in your book. It's called the radar screen, and you've been generous enough to make it available to our subscribers. And we'll tell you at the end how to get that. But just so the folks know what a valuable tool this is, just describe for us what it is and how you use it.
Well, one of the things we realized teams weren't doing was asking themselves, as a team, as a part of this organization, let's imagine it's in the org chart as a manager-led team. What is the work that actually requires us to be collaborative, and what work doesn't require collaboration? That question alone can change the way a team gets its work done, right? And so we devised this very simple little tool that asks teams to map levels of collaboration. So, for example, there will be a few pieces of work that the entire team will collaborate on. And we put that at the center of the radar screen because it's, in terms of collaborative effort, everybody's going to have a hand in it. Now, usually that's 2 or 3 things at most. Depends on the size of the team, but not a lot. The second concentric circle of our radar screen is where projects that involve subsets of the team are placed. So they require some collaboration, but not everybody and not all the time.
Okay.
And then the outer ring of the radar screen is important work that's going to be handled by individuals, right? So that we can account for all our work and we can know how much collaborative effort is actually required of this group and how much we can let individuals be the wonderful individuals they are and do the work they love to do and get satisfaction from. So one simple application is when you map the collaboration in this way of 3 concentric circles, the work at the center, the specific tasks and initiatives, become the foundation for your team meetings. Why? Because they're the work everybody's got a hand in and a stake in. All the other stuff can be dealt with outside of meetings. Imagine how freeing this can be for a group to say, wow.
Less meetings, less time at meetings.
Exactly. Shorter meeting agendas, more focused on what really matters to the people who are in the room, and then we can let the individuals and the subsets go do their thing in ways that are effective and efficient for them. So the radar screen was, it's just dead simple, right? But it's remarkable how effective it's been.
Yeah, when I looked at it, I said, "This is it," But then when I read through how you actually use it, and that's what we're going to include for our subscribers to HR Studio Podcast is the radar screen that Carlos is speaking about, but also your notes on how to actually use it, and you lay that out for teams that are physically present, but also for teams that are virtual as well. That's right.
Yeah, we have instructions on how to do that as well. Awesome. And, nowadays, I think half the teams I work with are, to some degree or another, not co-located, right? They're in different places.
Got it.
So
great.
We had both.
So, Carlos, thank you for making that available. And as we wrap up the podcast today, any final advice or thoughts for our audience around this team idea, this whole thing of teams and working together?
My invitation to my colleagues in HR, to team leaders, to senior leaders, is to rethink your assumptions about team building. Corporations are spending a ton of money and a ton of people's time on lovely exercises that aren't delivering results. And what I want my clients to do is spend their money in ways that really will make a difference to their bottom line. So my invitation is pause and think about how effective is what you're doing in the space of team building, and at least think about what you could do differently to get more bang for that team building buck, which is where I play.
Yep, and that whole notion, just to reinforce, of the individual motivation that people have, the individual challenges that can be on a team, and how do you avoid using a whole team approach to fix potentially individual problems. And I think about the radar screen too as a way to segment individual work from the team work. Those tools alone kind of tie into this whole idea of focus on what's truly team-based and don't spend time working on individual issues in the team environment.
Yeah, and it's great because it honors the great individual you've hired, and you don't have to undo your reward system or your pay system. You can let that be. Once you get your collaboration so clear and specific, you can actually start to include collaborative commitments in people's performance plans for the year, right? So you can use the tools and the systems you've got if you're willing to shift your thinking a little bit about what really makes a team effective. And it really starts with individuals.
Excellent. Well, Carlos, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. When does your book come out?
October 26th is
Excellent.
The official release date.
Great. So what we will do for our subscribers is in our show notes, we'll have a link so you can get that book from your favorite bookstore. We're going to have a link to the radar screen that Carlos has made available to us. HRstudiopodcast.com is where you can go to download prior episodes, sign up to be a subscriber, and we'll have all of Carlos's information and social links there as well. So Carlos, once again, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Fred. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. To discover additional information from this week's episode and to catch up on all episodes, visit HRstudiopodcast.com. Subscribe to the HR Studio Podcast list while there and receive alerts and future updates.